As Joe becomes more familiar with the future, the scale of the problem becomes impossible to ignore. The society is not merely silly. It is organized around incentives that consistently push people toward bad outcomes. Entertainment is everywhere. Advertising is everywhere. Corporate language is everywhere. Products are no longer simply products. They have become cultural identities. Public spaces feel like commercial environments. Television is not merely something people watch in their homes. It is an atmosphere. Information is constantly mixed with spectacle until the distinction becomes difficult to maintain. Joe's relationship with Rita also develops within this strange environment. Rita, like Joe, recognizes that something is fundamentally wrong, but she approaches the future from a different direction. She has survival instincts and practical awareness that complement Joe's observational abilities. Their relationship works because neither is a traditional heroic figure. They are two people trying to remain grounded, while surrounded by a culture that has forgotten what grounded means. The search for Rita becomes one of Joe's first motivations, but it gradually merges with the larger problem. The future is experiencing a water crisis. Crops are dying. The irrigation system is failing. Yet the population has embraced a corporate sports drink called Brondo so completely that the product has become associated with life itself. The joke is deliberately ridiculous. People are using a branded beverage where water should be used, and when the crops die, they somehow conclude that the solution may be to use more of the same product. But this is where Idiocracy shifts from personal comedy to systemic satire. The problem is no longer that one person does not understand reality. The problem is that the entire institution has been organized around avoiding reality. Brondo represents more than corporate influence. It represents a culture in which branding has become stronger than evidence. The product is not simply sold as a drink. It becomes a worldview. People trust it because they have been told to trust it, because everyone around them trusts it, and because questioning it would require admitting that the entire system has been built on a false assumption. That is why Joe's discovery is so important. He sees the water. He sees the crops. He sees the irrigation system. He understands the connection immediately. The future's population does not lack access to the facts in the same way that Joe lacks access to the future's culture. Instead, they lack the habit of connecting facts. Information exists, but critical thinking has become disconnected from information. That distinction becomes the engine of the second half of the film. And then President Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho enters the story like a human explosion. Played by Terry Crews with enormous physical energy, Camacho is one of the film's most memorable creations because he appears to represent everything the movie wants to mock about political spectacle. He is theatrical, aggressive, celebrity-like, and surrounded by branding and performance. His leadership style seems more appropriate for a wrestling arena than a government office. Yet the character is more complicated than a simple caricature of stupidity. Camacho possesses something Joe does not initially have: the ability to act decisively within the culture that exists. He may not understand the problem, but he understands how to command attention. He knows how to perform authority. And when the crisis becomes serious enough, he is capable of recognizing that Joe may have an answer. This creates an interesting contrast between the two men. Joe has competence without charisma. Camacho has charisma without conventional competence. The film's solution requires them to work together. That is important because Idiocracy does not ultimately argue that experts should replace politicians, or that intelligent people should simply take power away from everyone else. It suggests something more complicated. Leadership requires different forms of ability, and a functioning society must connect them. Joe can diagnose the problem. Camacho can mobilize the population. One understands reality. The other understands spectacle. In a healthier society, those capacities might coexist naturally. In the world of idiocracy, they have become separated. That separation is part of the crisis. Joe's appointment becomes increasingly consequential because the water problem cannot be solved by cleverness alone. He must convince institutions to act. He must overcome people who have financial reasons to defend Brando. He must explain basic science to officials who have been trained to distrust anything that conflicts with the established system. He must navigate political pressure while remaining someone who never wanted political power. The comedy becomes more effective because the consequences are now real. Earlier, the future stupidity is funny because Joe is confused by it. Later, the same stupidity becomes frightening because crops are dying. The movie deliberately changes the emotional meaning of its own jokes. The audience laughs at the absurdity of replacing water with a sports drink, and then the film reminds us that the absurdity is destroying agriculture. That is one of the reasons the story's water crisis works so well as a central metaphor. Water is basic. It is not glamorous. It cannot easily be branded into something more necessary than itself. It represents reality stripped of marketing. You can sell a bottle of water, but you cannot persuade a plant that a slogan is enough. Eventually, the physical world has the final vote. This is where the film's environmental argument becomes particularly direct. Society can manipulate language. It can manipulate advertising. It can manipulate public perception. It can manipulate politics. But it cannot negotiate indefinitely with ecological consequences. Crops either grow or they do not. Water either reaches the roots or it does not. The planet does not care which corporation has the better marketing department. The future's great mistake is therefore not simply stupidity. It is believing that branding can replace reality. The midpoint of the story arrives when Joe realizes that his biggest obstacle is not finding the answer. He already has the answer. The obstacle is convincing everyone else that the obvious answer is worth accepting. This is a subtle but crucial shift. In the first act, Joe's problem is personal survival. In the second act, his problem becomes institutional resistance. He has moved from asking, "Where am I?" to asking, "How do I make these people listen?" That transformation is the real beginning of his heroism. Joe does not suddenly become brave because the movie tells him to. He becomes responsible because the consequences of doing nothing become impossible to ignore. Rita supports him, and Frito, despite his limitations, becomes useful in ways Joe could never predict. This is another reason the movie's ensemble works. Everyone has a role in the system, even when the system is dysfunctional. Frito's incompetence is not entirely useless. Camacho's theatrics are not entirely useless. Joe's competence is not sufficient by itself. Rita's practicality matters. The film's world is absurd, but the solution is collaborative. The future cannot be rescued by a single genius standing above everyone else. It has to be repaired through people whose different abilities can finally be aligned with reality. When Joe attempts to communicate the crisis, the humor often comes from the repetition of obvious facts. He says something simple. The institution responds with confusion. He explains again. The response becomes even more absurd. This escalating structure is typical of Judge's comedy. The joke is not merely the individual line. The joke is the persistence of the system. A normal person would eventually recognize the contradiction and stop. The people in Idiocracy keep going because stopping would require them to question everything that brought them there. That is how institutional inertia works. Sometimes nobody is actively choosing the disaster. Everyone is simply continuing what the previous person did. The climax turns this idea into a surprisingly optimistic sequence. Joe's attempt to restore the water supply is not presented as the triumph of superior intelligence over inferior intelligence. It is the triumph of basic cause and effect over institutional denial. The irrigation system needs water. The crops need water. Water must be returned to the system. Once that happens, the possibility of recovery becomes visible. The moment is funny because it is so simple, but the simplicity is the point. The film has spent its entire runtime surrounding obvious realities with layers of distraction, branding, bureaucracy, and entertainment. When the distraction finally falls away, the solution looks almost embarrassingly straightforward. Joe's success changes his status. The man who began the story trying to avoid responsibility becomes someone the country trusts. Camacho's role also changes. His performance remains ridiculous, but he proves capable of recognizing when someone else knows what needs to be done. That is a form of leadership too. The future does not become magically intelligent at the end. Its problems are not erased. Instead, the film offers a possibility that the cycle can be interrupted. Joe becomes president, Rita becomes part of the country's new direction, and the film's final revelation about their descendants suggests that the future may begin moving toward greater competence. The ending is intentionally playful, but it contains a strange optimism. The movie has spent hours showing how easily a society can drift toward dysfunction, yet it does not conclude that decline is inevitable. Someone can notice. Someone can question. Someone can act. Systems can be repaired. The future is not predetermined. That may be the most important reason the film's ending does not feel entirely cynical. Joe Bowers becomes more interesting the longer we look at him because his character arc is almost the inverse of the traditional superhero story. He begins with very little ambition. He wants a quiet life. He avoids responsibility. He is not interested in becoming powerful. His greatest flaw is passivity. Yet the future turns that passivity into a challenge. When everyone else is unwilling to act, Joe eventually has to decide whether remaining uninvolved is morally acceptable. The answer becomes no. His transformation, therefore, has less to do with intelligence than responsibility. He does not become smarter. He becomes more willing to use what he already knows. That distinction is essential. Intelligence is potential. Competence is applied knowledge. Wisdom involves understanding consequences. Leadership requires responsibility. Joe gradually moves through those levels. First, he merely notices things. Then he understands them. Then he explains them. Eventually, he accepts responsibility for what happens if nobody listens. His relationship with Rita strengthens that development, because she is not simply a reward waiting at the end of his journey. She is a partner who challenges his isolation. Rita understands that survival requires action. Joe understands systems. Their combination becomes more effective than either alone. Joe's ordinariness also makes him an audience surrogate. Viewers do not need to imagine being geniuses to understand him. They only need to imagine waking up in a society where familiar assumptions have disappeared. His confusion becomes our confusion. His frustration becomes ours. When he realizes that people do not understand basic concepts, we laugh because we recognize how strange the situation is. But when he realizes that nobody will listen, the laughter becomes uncomfortable. That is where the character becomes more than a joke. Joe's reluctance to hold power also separates him from many traditional political heroes. He does not want the presidency because he dreams of greatness. He ends up there because the system needs someone capable of asking basic questions. The irony is obvious. The man who spent his life avoiding responsibility becomes president precisely because he learns to accept it. The society itself functions as the film's true antagonist. There is no single evil mastermind manipulating everything from a secret headquarters. There does not need to be one. Corporations, political institutions, entertainment systems, bureaucracies, and ordinary habits reinforce one another. Brando benefits because people buy it. People buy it because branding has become culturally dominant. Institutions defend it because changing course would admit failure. Politicians tolerate it because it is popular. Consumers defend it because it is familiar. Nobody needs to coordinate the disaster. The system can produce it automatically. This is why the film's antagonist is better understood as an ecosystem of incentives. Corporate profit rewards consumption. Entertainment rewards attention. Politics rewards visibility. Bureaucracy rewards procedural compliance. Social conformity rewards agreement. Short-term thinking rewards immediate gratification. The result is a world where many individual decisions can be rational from a narrow perspective, while the collective result is disastrous. Frito is an excellent example. He is not trying to destroy society. He is trying to make money. He adapts to the incentives around him. Brando is not necessarily evil in the conventional sense either. It is a corporation trying to sell its product. The problem arises when commercial logic expands into areas where it cannot safely replace physical reality. Water is not merely another market category. Agriculture cannot be governed entirely by branding. That is the invisible antagonist. The belief that every problem can be solved by the same mechanisms that sell products. When convenience becomes the dominant value, anything difficult begins to look unreasonable. Expertise becomes annoying because experts complicate simple answers. Regulation becomes inconvenient because it slows things down. Long-term planning becomes unattractive because it does not produce immediate gratification. Critical thinking becomes exhausting because it requires attention. The population of Idiocracy does not wake up every morning intending to make civilization worse. Most of them simply follow the path that has been made easiest for them. That is what makes the satire more uncomfortable. Malice is easy to recognize. Systemic stupidity is harder because it often looks like ordinary life. Rita provides an important corrective to the film's male-centered premise. She is capable, observant, and pragmatic, and her presence makes it harder to reduce the story to one average man becomes a genius. She understands people differently from Joe. She has learned to read situations quickly, and her survival instincts are valuable in a society where conventional rules have become unreliable. Her relationship with Joe also demonstrates that competence comes in different forms. Joe has institutional knowledge from the past. Rita has adaptability. Together they become more capable than either would be alone. Frito, meanwhile, represents another layer of the satire. His confidence is often disproportionate to his understanding, yet he is not completely useless. He can navigate the future because he belongs to it. This creates an ironic partnership. Joe understands what the world should be doing, while Frito understands how the world currently operates. That distinction allows the film to make jokes about stupidity, without making every character completely interchangeable. President Camacho is perhaps the strongest example of this complexity. On the surface, he is pure spectacle. His name is absurd. His physicality is exaggerated. His leadership style is theatrical. But Terry Crews plays him with enough conviction that the character becomes more than a one-note joke. Camacho has instincts. He can recognize charisma. He can command a room. And, crucially, he can sometimes recognize his own limitations. When the crisis becomes serious, he is willing to give Joe authority. That does not make him a conventional hero, but it prevents the film from collapsing into an easy intelligence versus stupidity binary. The supporting cast works similarly. Bureaucrats, television personalities, corporate representatives, and ordinary citizens fill the background with small behaviors that make the world feel lived in. The movie's comedy depends heavily on these details, because the audience is constantly being reminded that the characters do not think they are in a satire. They think they are living normal lives. That is one of Mike Judge's greatest strengths. The funniest world is often the world in which nobody realizes that anything is funny. At the center of the film's themes is a question that sounds simple but is surprisingly difficult to answer. What does it mean for a society to become less intelligent? If the answer is simply people have lower IQs, then Idiocracy is both scientifically questionable and philosophically limited. But if the question is instead about critical thinking, institutional competence, educational priorities, attention, and cultural incentives, the film becomes far richer. Intelligence and critical thinking are not identical. Someone can be intelligent but intellectually lazy. Someone can be educated but unable to question assumptions. Someone can possess enormous technical knowledge but still make terrible decisions because they are motivated by fear, ego, or convenience. Idiocracy repeatedly shows people accepting information because it comes from an established source rather than because they have examined it. That is anti-intellectualism in a broader sense, not merely disliking smart people, but becoming suspicious of the process of careful reasoning itself. Expertise becomes something associated with inconvenience. Simple answers become attractive because they are emotionally satisfying. Consumerism intensifies this pattern by teaching people to think in terms of immediate solutions. Need entertainment? Buy it. Need status? Display the brand. Need identity? Wear the logo. Need a political position? Choose the loudest personality. Need a solution? Find the product. The problem is that reality does not always provide convenient answers. Environmental systems require maintenance. Institutions require competence. Education requires effort. Democracy requires participation. Science requires uncertainty and revision. Long-term planning requires accepting sacrifices before benefits appear. These are difficult things to market because they do not always produce immediate emotional rewards. The film exaggerates this conflict until the population literally cannot distinguish a sports drink from a necessary natural resource. That is the joke. But beneath the joke is a warning about what happens when convenience becomes a cultural currency. If every difficult idea is treated as annoying and every complicated problem is expected to have an easy answer, society becomes vulnerable to whoever can provide the most satisfying simplification. The movie's visual design reinforces these themes constantly. Its future is not sleek. It does not resemble the polished utopias of traditional science fiction. Instead, it looks commercially assembled. Advertising is enormous. Logos dominate spaces. Buildings appear functional but degraded. Products are brightly branded, even when the surrounding infrastructure is falling apart. Technology exists alongside decay, producing one of the film's most important visual contradictions. The future has advanced devices but cannot maintain basic systems. This contrast tells us that technological progress does not automatically equal social progress. A society can invent new entertainment while losing agricultural competence. It can create new consumer products while destroying infrastructure. It can become more connected while becoming less capable of distinguishing information from noise. The visual comedy of oversized logos is therefore not merely about advertising being annoying. It is about the colonization of physical space by commercial identity. Brando's presence becomes almost environmental. The brand is everywhere because the culture has stopped treating branding as something external. It has become part of how people understand reality. Television screens add another layer. They are not simply entertainment devices. They become background noise, shaping the emotional atmosphere of public life. The future is constantly talking, constantly selling, constantly distracting. Silence becomes unusual. Natural environments are comparatively scarce, which makes water and agriculture even more important. The crops represent something outside the commercial system. Plants do not care about slogans. They respond to water, sunlight, soil, and biological conditions. The agricultural crisis therefore functions as a return of physical reality. The natural world becomes the one thing that cannot be persuaded by propaganda. When the movie places water against Brando, it is placing necessity against branding, reality against representation, and nature against consumer culture. The deeper philosophical problem becomes clearer when we examine the film's genetic premise. Idiocracy famously suggests that society becomes less intelligent because people with certain traits reproduce more than people with others. As satire, the premise is intentionally provocative. As a literal explanation for social decline, it is far too simplistic. Human intelligence is influenced by many interacting genetic and environmental factors, and cultural institutions can dramatically affect educational outcomes, health, opportunity, and cognitive development. The movie compresses a complicated question into a comic mechanism because it needs the audience to understand its world quickly. But that simplification creates one of the film's biggest weaknesses. It risks turning social dysfunction into a biological hierarchy, as though the people at the bottom of the system are naturally inferior rather than shaped by institutions and incentives. That interpretation is particularly uncomfortable because the film often associates intelligence with class and cultural refinement. Yet the film's own story complicates that message. Joe is not an aristocratic intellectual. Rita is not a scholar. Camacho is not a conventional intellectual either, yet he can still act decisively. Frito is ridiculous but adaptive. The population may be incompetent, but it is not composed entirely of villains. The more charitable reading is that the film is actually about cultural inheritance rather than pure genetics. People inherit habits, assumptions, institutions, language, media preferences, and social norms. A child does not need to inherit stupidity genetically to grow up in an environment that discourages curiosity. A culture can reproduce its own weaknesses through imitation. If everyone around you treats expertise as suspicious, you learn suspicion. If everyone treats sensational entertainment as normal, you learn to seek it. If everyone trusts a brand, you learn to trust the brand. If nobody asks why a system works, you may never learn to ask either. This is closer to the film's most interesting idea. Dysfunctional behavior can become self-reinforcing. The society teaches itself how to remain dysfunctional. That is why the movie's genetic premise should not be treated as its final philosophical answer. Its stronger insight lies in the cultural machinery built around that premise. Institutions reinforce habits. Habits become expectations. Expectations shape incentives. Incentives influence behavior. Eventually, behavior looks like culture, and culture begins to feel inevitable. That is the real trap. Although Idiocracy is live action, its visual storytelling often operates with the density associated with animation. Production design carries jokes in the background. Costumes communicate social hierarchy. Makeup exaggerates physical characteristics without making the world completely fantastical. Sets are filled with recognizable objects that have been repurposed or degraded. This approach is crucial because the future becomes believable precisely because it does not look futuristic in the conventional sense. Instead of designing objects from scratch, the filmmakers imagine what happens when familiar consumer culture continues evolving without meaningful correction. Technology looks cheap because the society values convenience over craftsmanship. Public spaces feel commercial because branding has become a dominant organizing principle. The environment looks worn because maintenance has been neglected. Extras do not simply stand in the background. Their behavior contributes to the illusion that this is a functioning society. People are watching screens. People are consuming products. People are moving through spaces as if the absurdity is ordinary. The low-budget aesthetic is therefore not necessarily a limitation. It becomes part of the satire. A glossy science fiction future might distance the audience from the message. This future looks like something that could be assembled from existing materials. It is ridiculous, but it is commercially recognizable. That combination is what makes the film visually effective. The world feels less like an alternate universe and more like a distorted continuation of the present. Mike Judge's directorial style is built around observation. His characters often behave as though the absurdity surrounding them is completely normal. That is one reason the humor feels different from comedy that constantly signals its own jokes. Judge does not need every character to turn toward the camera and announce that something is ridiculous. Instead, he allows the situation to exist. Joe reacts with confusion, but many other characters respond without surprise. That contrast creates the comedy. The audience sees the gap between what should be happening and what is happening, while the characters continue as though everything is fine. This deadpan approach is one of Judge's defining strengths. His earlier work had already explored dysfunctional institutions, workplace absurdity, media culture, and people who are trapped inside systems they barely understand. Idiocracy expands that approach from the workplace and suburban environment to an entire civilization. The joke becomes larger, but the method remains observational. Luke Wilson's performance as Joe is restrained, which is essential. If Joe reacted to every absurdity with theatrical disbelief, the film would become exhausting. His calm confusion provides a stable point of reference. Terry Crews, by contrast, brings enormous physical energy to Camacho. The contrast between the two performances creates another layer of comedy. Joe is understated because he is processing. Camacho is oversized because he is performing. Neither approach would work as well without the other. Judge also uses pacing carefully. Absurdity escalates gradually. One strange detail becomes another. then another, until the audience realizes that the entire system is built from contradictions. Background jokes reward attention because the film expects viewers to look beyond the dialogue. This density also contributes to rewatchability. The first viewing is often about following Joe through the story. Later viewings allow the audience to notice how much information the production design was providing all along. The world itself is the punchline. Music plays an unexpectedly important role, because Idiocracy has to balance two emotional realities. The movie is a comedy, but its central crisis is real. Crops are dying. Water is disappearing from the agricultural system. Society is approaching a point where consequences cannot be laughed away. Theodore Shapiro's score helps bridge those tonal extremes. When the music becomes more traditionally dramatic, the audience is reminded that the stakes are real even when the surrounding imagery remains absurd. This is especially important during Joe's journey toward responsibility. The film can use heroic musical language around a man whose most extraordinary accomplishment is recognizing the importance of water, and the contrast becomes part of the joke. But it also gives the moment genuine emotional weight. Traditional cinematic language tells us that Joe's actions matter. The audience begins to care about the outcome even while laughing at the circumstances. Sound design works similarly. Television audio, commercials, crowd reactions, exaggerated effects, and political spectacle create an environment of constant noise. The future is not merely visually saturated with entertainment. It is acoustically saturated. Information competes with commercials. Political speech competes with crowd reactions. Dialogue competes with screens. This creates an important distinction between information and noise. A society can be surrounded by communication and still suffer from a lack of understanding. More voices do not automatically produce more knowledge. More content does not automatically produce more information. More technology does not automatically produce better decisions. The movie's soundscape reinforces that idea by making the future feel loud, even when very little meaningful communication is occurring. When quiet moments appear, they become noticeable. Silence gives the audience space to observe rather than react. That contrast helps the more serious moments land. The movie's cultural afterlife is almost as strange as its fictional future. In 2006, Idiocracy did not arrive as an obvious cultural giant. Its theatrical presence was limited. Its marketing was not comparable to the largest studio comedies, and its path to widespread recognition was unusual. Yet the film found an audience through home media, word of mouth, and eventually internet culture. This is deeply ironic because the movie itself is about media systems that shape what people notice. Its commercial journey demonstrated that a film can be neglected by traditional distribution while being discovered by audiences through alternative channels. People quoted the movie. They shared scenes. They remembered Camacho. They repeated Brando jokes. They used "Ow my balls" as shorthand for sensational entertainment. The film became a cult object partly because it was easy to quote and partly because its world was endlessly reusable as a reference point. Cult films often survive because viewers feel they have discovered something that mainstream culture overlooked. Idiocracy benefited from that feeling. The movie's rewatchability also mattered. Its background jokes and recognizable characters made it easy to revisit. Over time, audiences could return to it with new cultural experiences and notice different parallels. During the rise of social media, some of its concepts became newly resonant. Corporate branding became even more integrated into digital identity. Political communication became increasingly shaped by personality and spectacle. Online algorithms created new forms of attention competition. Short-form entertainment became dominant. None of these developments proved that the film predicted them, but they gave audiences new reasons to use the movie as a metaphor. That distinction is essential. Cultural influence is not the same thing as prophecy. A work can become influential because later generations find language in it for experiences the creators never specifically anticipated. Critically, the film's reputation has always been complicated. Some viewers embrace Judge's satire immediately, while others found the humor too broad, juvenile, or simplistic to support the larger ideas. Both reactions are understandable. Idiocracy often makes sophisticated observations through intentionally crude methods. That can be effective because the contrast is surprising, but it can also undermine the message. When the movie is at its best, the vulgarity creates an opening for deeper thought. When it is at its weakest, the vulgarity simply becomes the point. This creates a tension between the film's intellectual ambition and its comedic instincts. Critics who objected to the crude humor were not necessarily missing the satire. The satire itself sometimes depends on crude humor so heavily that it becomes difficult to separate the observation from the delivery. On the other hand, audiences who discovered the movie later were able to judge it in a different context. Home viewing allowed people to pause, rewatch, quote, and discuss. Internet culture turned isolated jokes into shared references. The movie's reputation could therefore grow independently of its original critical reception. That does not mean every later praise is deserved. Cult status can sometimes cause audiences to romanticize a flawed work. But Idiocracy has enough world-building and observational detail to justify much of its longevity. Its strongest jokes are not necessarily the loudest ones. They are the jokes that make the audience realize that a character's behavior is completely logical within a ridiculous system. That kind of comedy tends to age better because it depends less on a specific reference and more on recognizing human behavior. The film's controversies deserve equal attention, because celebrating its relevance without examining its weaknesses would produce exactly the kind of simplistic thinking the movie itself warns against. The most obvious problem is genetic determinism. The opening premise suggests that intelligence declines because of reproductive patterns, and that argument is dramatically simplified. It can easily be interpreted as saying that certain people are biologically inferior, or that social problems are caused primarily by the reproduction of the wrong people. That is not only scientifically inadequate, it is morally uncomfortable. Intelligence should not be treated as a measure of human worth. Education, opportunity, environment, nutrition, social stability, and institutional quality all influence cognitive development and life outcomes. The film's treatment of class can also be broad. Its future population is often portrayed through stereotypes associated with poverty, poor education, sexual excess, and consumerism. That creates a risk of punching downward rather than upward. A satire of social dysfunction can accidentally mock the people most affected by dysfunctional systems, instead of the institutions producing those conditions. The movie is stronger when it targets corporations, bureaucracies, political spectacle, and cultural incentives than when it treats individual people as inherently inferior. There is also a question of whether the film punches in multiple directions at once. It mocks elites, ordinary consumers, politicians, corporations, media, and intellectual assumptions. That complexity can be valuable, but it can also make the satire less precise. The viewer is left to decide whether the movie is criticizing stupidity, conformity, consumerism, elitism, or all of them simultaneously. Perhaps the answer is all of them, but not equally. Its best moments criticize systems that reward bad behavior. Its weaker moments rely on stereotypes to make the joke faster. That distinction matters when assessing the film today. A movie can be culturally powerful and still contain ideas that deserve criticism. In fact, acknowledging those flaws makes the analysis more useful because it prevents nostalgia from becoming another form of uncritical consumption. The movie's financial trajectory reinforces another major theme. Commercial success and cultural value are not identical. Idiocracy did not become an important film because it dominated the box office. Its long-term life developed differently. Limited theatrical exposure restricted its initial reach, while home media and word of mouth allowed audiences to find it gradually. This is important because traditional film economics often treat opening performance as a decisive measure of success. But some films are better understood as long-tail cultural products. They accumulate value slowly. They become reference points. They are rediscovered by younger audiences. They generate clips, quotes, memes, and discussions long after their initial marketing cycle ends. Idiocracy became particularly suited to this model because its humor is highly fragmentable. Individual scenes can circulate independently. Characters can become memes. Lines can become political references. A fictional product can become shorthand for corporate absurdity. In the streaming era, the distance between theatrical failure and cultural recognition has become even more complicated. Audiences can discover older films without needing a studio to relaunch them theatrically. A movie can effectively have several lives: its original release, its home video period, its internet rediscovery, and its later algorithmic circulation. Idiocracy demonstrates the value of that long tail. It also illustrates why studios sometimes misunderstand unconventional satire. A difficult-to-market film may have no obvious demographic category. It may be too crude for one audience, too political for another, too strange for a third. But difficulty of marketing does not necessarily mean lack of audience. Sometimes it means the audience will have to find the film themselves.
Enlike conventional franchises, Idiocracy has remained essentially a standalone property. There is no sprawling cinematic universe built around your buyers. There is no traditional sale machine. That is fitting because the movie's cultural identity depends partly on its self-contained world. Its influence comes less from expansion and more from repetition. Mickey's broader career also helps it plan why the film feels distinctive. His work repeatedly focuses on people trapped inside the systems that are both ridiculous and recognizable. Whether the environment is a workplace, a television culture, or an entire future civilization, the underlying question remains similar. Why do people continue participating in systems that obviously do not work? The answer is often that the system rewards participation. That is why Idiocracy feels connected to yet his earlier work even when the scale is radically larger. Its production history also illustrates studio risk aversion. Satire kan be difficult to sell beschouwse marketing departments van clear messages, clear audiences, and recognizable emotional hooks. A komedie-wose central character is intentionele afvragen and wose future is built around institutional stupidity does not fit neatly into those categories. Uit its afterlife demonstrates wy en konvensioneel films gaan bekome variable oorvertieme. Audiense dystovery is not always predictable. So met die miste word dat look strange in a religieuses schedule bekomes exactly te word people remember eiers later. Historically Idiocracy belongs to a long tradition of American satire that uses exaggerated features to criticize present behavior. Dystopian fiction often works by moving familiar problems into unfamiliar environments. Instead of telling audiences that consumerism is dangerous, it solves associëre consumerism as bekome te organizing principle of reality. Instead of saying polities gaan bekome entertainment, it creates a precedent whose public identity resembles a spectacle. Instead of warning that environmental neglect has consequences, it creates a nation that literally forgets what water is for. This is not a new strategy, but yet a place a trouge brood komende rather than conventional science fiction. Dat maak the movie initial. It can sit alongside the political satires and dystopian comedies while remaining distanced to American pop satire. Its legate also belongs to internet humor. Camacho bekame particularly durable because his image is instantly recognizable and his character can be removed from the original story and is it as a cultural symbol. That is what happens when a character crosses from narrative into meme satire. The character stops belonging exclusively to the movie and becomes part of a shared vocabulary. Tesame is tree of Brando and of my balls. Each becomes soortand for a larger idea. Brando can represent corporate absurdity. Of my balls can represent sensational entertainment. Camacho can represent political spectacle. This soortand is one reason the movie has remained visible even among people who have nie verwatched it but becoming a reference point is not the same as being historically accurate. The film is best understood as a time capsule that accidentally remained useful. Some elements of that time capsule are remarkably timeless. Consumerism has not disappeared. Corporate influence has not disappeared. Institutional incompetence has not disappeared. Political spectacle has not disappeared. Environmental neglect has certainly not disappeared. The idea that entertainment can compete with the information is arguably more relevant than ever. But other parts of the movie are unmistakably dated. Its assumptions about technology belong to the mid-2000s. Its understanding of the internet is limited by what the internet was at the time. Its sexual humor reflects the comedy satire of its era. Some stereotypes that were applied casually in 2006 can feel much more uncomfortable to contemporary viewers. The film should not have predicted the exact shape of smartphones, social media, influencers, recommendation algorithms, or the enormous creator economy. In some ways, the movie's satire is therefore completely wrong. But that does not invalidate its themes. In fact, the mismatch can be revealing. The satire we actually receive is not identical to the satire yet imagined. Technology became more sophisticated rather than simply cheaper. Communication became more immediate rather than disappearing. Information became more accessible rather than vanishing. Uit the problem of attention become more complicated. The film accidentally predicted certain cultural dynamics without predicting their technology. That is perhaps the most useful way to understand its legacy. It did not predict the devices. It exaggerated the incentives. It did not knowf exactly of entertainment world evolve. It understood that entertainment world compete aggressively for attention. It did not predict every political development. It recognized that political spectacle could become powerful. The movie is therefore both dated and strongly stimulus and the tension between two sexualities is part of what makes it worth revisiting. So weer dus dat lieve Idiocracy as a film. Its greatest strength remains its worldbuilding. The movie creates an environment where jokes exist at every level, from dialogue to architecture to productizing to background behavior. Its performances are also stronger than the broadkomende maghetsigist. Like Wilson understands that you works best when played as a normal person trapped in an abnormal world. Maar Rudolph begeves Rita grounded practicality. That separt turns Frito into a memorable embodiment of confidence without understanding. Anterij kreefs makes Camacho unforgettable by combining absurdity with a genuine presence. The most effective satire oskers when the film sonnets a ridiculous joke to a real consequence. Bravendo is funny because the premise is absurd, but it becomes memorable because the water crisis makes the joke meaningful. The movie's weaknesses are equally clear. Its genetic premise is simplistic. Its class stereotypes gaan by incomfortable. Some jokes are juvenile. Some satirical targets are too broadly definite. Its humor kan sometimes undermine its of an intellectual argument. But those weaknesses do not erase its strengths. They make the movie even rather than worthless. The distinction matters because entertainment value and intellectual precision are different measurements. A film does not need to be scientifically rigorous to be culturally provocative, but audiences help not confuse provocative satire with a scientific threat. Idiocracy deserves analysis precisely because it sits in that complicated space. It is funny enough to remain entertaining, flawed enough to invite criticism, and observant enough to reward deeper examination. Its best achievement is not that it predicted a particular future. Its best achievement is that it created a fictional world capable of making audiences gestion te real one. And that brings us back to you boys walking up 500 years after his own time. He opens his ears expecting a future that has surpassed him. Instead, he discovers a future that has forgotten some of the things his society already knew. At first, the joke is that you is afvragen and everyone else is incompetent. But by the end, that joke has changed. You becomes valuable because he is willing to pay attention. He sees a problem and refuses to accept the explanation everyone else has inherited. He asks where the water went. He asks why the crops are dying. He asks whether the solution actually makes sense. Those questions are almost embarrassingly simple. That is why they matter. Civilization does not collapse only because people become incapable of understanding complicated ideas. Sometimes it becomes vulnerable because nobody is willing to stop and question simple assumptions. Intelligence alone gaan not save as society. Institutions need maintenance. Expertise needs respect. Education needs investment. Information needs evaluation. Environmental systems need protection. Democracy needs citizens willing to distinguish performance from competence. Technology needs people capable of deciding what itself beïset for. And convenience, although gewone of the great achievements of modern life, gaan bekome dangerous when convenience becomes more important than truth. Entertainment is not the enemy either. Idiocracy itself is entertainment. The probleem begins when entertainment becomes the only langgetrou gewyd populaire willing to engage with the reality. As society gaan enjoy jokes and still think critically. It can consume products and still understand limits. It can admire celebrities and still listen to experts. It can use technology without surrendering judgment. The future is not predetermined. That might be a hopeful idea hidden inside this deeply cynical movie. Jou Andrita's story suggests that decline gaan be interrupted. As sultire kan notice wat it has forgotten. Institutions gaan be repaired. People kan change keuze. The answer does not require everyone to become a genius. Perhaps the real requirement is much smaller and much harder. Remain curious. Ask why. Ask how. Ask what happens next. Ask whether the solution is actually solving the problem. Ask whether the person speaking loudly is also the person who understands the subject. Ask whether something is true because it is popular or popular because it is reported. Ask whether convenience has greatly replaced responsibility. Those questions sound ordinary. In Idiocracy, ordinary questions become revolutionary. And maybe that is why the movie continues to survive long after its original release. Not because it perfectly predicted the future and not because every joke aged well, but because it understood one uncomfortable truth about human societies. Decline rarely announces itself as decline. It usually arrives disguised as convenience, entertainment, efficiency, popularity, familiarity, or simply the decision not to bother asking one more question. Idiocracy exaggerates that process until it becomes ridiculous. But the reason the exaggeration gaan stil maken is incomfortable is dat somewhere beneath the ridiculous future is a recognizable present. The movie asks whether we are becoming stupid. The more is a volkstion mij beweder we are becoming accustomed to systems that reward is for acting as if we are. And perhaps that is the film's most important legacy. It was never necessary for me to predict exactly what the future would look like. I only had to remind is that the future is built from the habits we normalize today. So the net time you buyers walkers up in that absurd world, maybe the joke is not that he is the smartest man alive. Maybe the joke is that being willing to notice what everyone else has stopped noticing kan beïnhoude te maak aan ordinary persoonlijke genees. Antef Idiocracy liafis is wat de onegistion word te karang by hon te credits, it is tes, dit te movie predicte futire, or dit het simply exagerate te present sowel dat we eventuele leernet hof to recognize ourselves in it.